as we think about public interest and, the one thing we talk about on the show all the time is the Johnny Carson model versus the Colbert model. And both of them respectively were top in late night, which is a remarkable reflection on some of the macro trends you've just been talking about.
One was top in making money and one was top in losing money.
Yes. So although it's remarkable that Colbert, I think, was able to be top in ratings, and that's with a much lower number that Colbert than Johnny Carson was, because you're just competing for a smaller slice of the public, because the scarcity that meant you were allocating licenses to them in the past has basically evaporated with different technology. I mean, it still exists, obviously, with broadcast licenses, but it's different with all of the other technology. So if Colbert is doing a broadly anti-Trump show, does that mean CBS is not operating in the public interest?
Well, the one interesting question is, Congress has created special rules for equal opportunity, equal time, for instance. And the FCC has said, actually statutorily, that those particular rules don't apply to a bona fide news program. And at least historically, there were some late night shows where the FCC would say that sort of couch sit-down interview portion was itself a bona fide newscast and therefore exempt from the congressional political rules, meaning if you were in the relevant period of time before an election, you could have one candidate on and not the other. We haven't looked at those rules in a long time, but it strikes me that a lot has changed since the FCC first started saying that those couch sit-downs are bona fide news programs. And it would seem to me that before the FCC would provide any such exemption to any of these late shows, I think they should come back into the FCC and re-up any requests, because it's not clear to me that they would qualify as bona fide news programs. But again, the obligation isn't on CBS itself as a national programmer. The public interest obligation, is on the local TV station. So for instance, if they don't feel like the programs that they're getting from CBS Central meet the needs of their communities or further the public interest, then they should have the right, and they're supposed to in their agreements, to preempt the programming and do something else. In fact, a week or so ago, I started a new inquiry into Comcast, which owns NBC, and I've asked to get copies of their agreements with the local TV stations to try to make sure that there's not terms or conditions in that relationship between, again, national programmer and the actual TV station that is precluding the TV station from fulfilling its public interest obligations. So, those are sort of a cluster of issues that we need to look at.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. We can put this up on the screen because I'm reading from a Variety report as of last week that you informed Comcast on Tuesday you're launching an investigation of the company's relations with NBC affiliates. And they write, days after President Trump called for the network to be held, quote unquote, accountable for favoring the Dem Party and threatened to revoke broadcast licenses, the FCC has an interest in and the authority to promote the public interest and to ensure that local broadcast TV stations retain the economic and operational independence necessary to meet their public interest obligations, is your point. And so I basically want to ask in this case, do you see your deregulatory agenda as actually complementary to course correcting or helping the media course correct to being more aligned with that perspective on public interest?
Yeah, I think so. Again, fundamentally, our North Star in the media portion of the FCC's docket, and there's other stuff that we do. In fact, we have a whole Build America agenda that we're running that looks at spectrum and infrastructure and workforce issue. But within the media space in particular, my North Star is I want to find ways to empower those local broadcast TV stations, the ones that are actually licensed by the FCC, and they're owned by a range of different companies, Nexstar, Gray, Sinclair, to empower those stations to feel like they can serve the needs of their communities and to some extent to shrink the power of the national programmers like CBS, NBC, ABC. And so by looking at NBC and the contractual relationships they have with the local stations, it's consistent with that broader goal that we're trying to push in the media ecosystem.
And to the point that Variety sort of combined these two things, noting that you sent Comcast that letter after Donald Trump called for NBC to be held accountable. That doesn't that doesn't strike you as inappropriate? I mean, I'm guessing because you're involved in it, but it's not inappropriate from your perspective to have the president criticizing the networks, pressuring the networks for different coverage, and then acting with that letter from your part.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, I've sent a number of letters at this point to lots of the entities that we regulate, whether it's Comcast. I've sent letters and inquiries to Disney, which runs ABC. Of course, we've done issues with Verizon as well. We're working with a lot of different companies across these regulated spheres, and I want to move them all in a direction that promotes the public interest, whether it's, a company like Verizon, where they've agreed to end their DEI, their invidious forms of DEI discrimination. I think that's a good thing. Disney, ABC, I'm looking similarly at some DEI issues there, whether it's Comcast looking at this network affiliation relationship. I mean, there's going to be a lot of activity. The FCC's busy place. There's going to be a lot of activity between the FCC and regulated entities. And President Trump is also, very focused on media issues as a general matter from his public feed. You can see that. And so I do think, we're both going to be speaking on similar issues at similar times. But I think that's going to continue because that's where our focus is.
Yeah, and we have this from The Verge as well. The Freedom of Press Foundation filed a complaint against you with the Office of Disciplinary Counsel at the D.C. Court of Appeals, alleging that you had repeatedly broken basic principles of conduct as a licensed attorney, including by leveraging your power to control media outlet speech. But The Verge, in their coverage of this letter, even admits, as a legal complaint, quote, it's a long shot, but the filing accuses you of perpetuating a quote-unquote unconstitutional shakedown. Now, I know you don't agree with that characterization, but I think this was just filed today. So what's your response, Mr. Chairman, to this complaint that was filed here in D.C.?
Well, look, it's obviously a totally frivolous filing that's simply trying to intimidate the FCC and stop us from doing our job. And I can assure you that that is not going to happen. If anything, we're going to continue to accelerate our work. We've got an obligation from Congress to enforce a public interest mandate on broadcasters. And, that's exactly what we're going to do. And we're going to, keep at it as long as we have the privilege of serving this job. I'm not worried about that filing. It was an attempt, I think, to get a headline, and maybe they got one in The Verge. But beyond that, it has no meaning to me.
Okay, so just returning as we wrap up here to that question of scarcity. I'm a millennial. It's weird for me. I can't imagine what it's like for Gen Z and people, Gen Alpha next up, who don't know, as you said, who Juicy Smollett even is, Mr. Chairman, to think about anything in the media world as being scarce because there's just so much technological capacity for competition now. So I wanted to ask you a little bit what your own media diet looks like. What are you consuming? Are you deep in the podcast world? How do you think about these things based on your own consumption of different media on your own?
Yeah, I've definitely shifted a lot into podcasts. I mean, really, it sort of accelerated during COVID-19. I sort of kept the habit up. But yours is a good one, so we've got to keep that in the mix as well. But I listen
good answer.
A lot of Ruthless, a lot of All In podcasts. Try to take in a variety of different things. But you're right. I mean, this idea of scarcity in broadcast, which has justified historically the licensing of these stations, may seem odd to people. But at the same time, it's a decision that Congress made, and it's up to the FCC to enforce it. If people don't like it, again, they can go to Congress and they can say, we don't think it makes sense anymore to treat broadcasters different, given all the competition that's out there. But until that happens, we got to enforce the law. And I do think that there's some changes we should do in the media space in light of podcasts and all this competition, because if you look at local TV stations, for instance, they're competing really in the market for advertising dollars. And if you look at sort of the percentage of advertising dollars that had supported local TV stations that has swung to digital, whether it's Google or Facebook, it's a dramatic number. And we saw this first with newspapers, right? We've got hundreds and hundreds of newspapers that have shuttered all across the country. And to some extent, that's the ghost of Christmas future for local TV stations if the FCC doesn't update its approach so that those local stations can compete with Google, with Facebook in the market for advertising. Because I do think there's still something very important in this country to have local news, local reporters, local journalists. And to some extent, that's unique among the broadcast TV, because podcasts and cable channels, they're really good at the national stories, but it's those local reporters at local TV stations that cover the local stories. And so I do think, again, empowering those to continue to do well, to survive, to stay in business is part of what the FCC does, even if it does pinch some of those national programmers a little bit.
And last question, as I think about this as someone on the right and, broadly supportive of the idea that competition generally makes a better product, I look at all this competition. I look at, how Colbert, I think, made that show, drove that show into the ground from my perspective, because he was going for a narrow slice that was more and more loyal of the public. And that's how you end up with, I think his average is probably 2.5, 3 million, somewhere like that. But still losing money for the network. So anyway, all that is to say, is this competition making any of those outlets right now better, or is that trend sort of yet to be seen from your perspective?
I do think that the competition is helping. I do think that the market forces are encouraging right now. Again, if you just sort of run your program the way CBS had allowed the Colbert Show to be run, they're losing money. And so I do think you're seeing a market course correction there, which is needed. But a lot of the stuff you see across the board, I mean, frankly, with NPR and PBS as well, with Congress passing laws to defund them, really they only have themselves to blame. For years, it wasn't that long ago, that NPR and PBS, their viewership was a pretty good cross-section of the American electorate as a general matter. When you're basically forcing the American people to have money taken out of their pocketbooks to support something, I think it makes sense that you would attempt to be broadly appealable. But as a former editor at NPR, Uri Berliner, had put out a lot of op-eds on this, said, in his view, NPR just increasingly tried to appeal to a narrower and narrower base of basically, Acela corridor listeners. And then, that bargain with the American people of forcing them to subsidize it no longer made sense. And so I do think across the board, obviously there was some government action there, but we are seeing some market forces and some course corrections. I think that's a good thing. It's definitely needed.
Over the years, I hope I've been clear about this. I'm not just pro-birth, I'm pro-life. And being pro-life, of course, means standing with mothers not only before their baby is born, but long after. And that is exactly why I partner with Preborn. Preborn is awesome. They don't just save babies, they make motherhood abundantly possible. They provide free ultrasounds and share the truth of the gospel with women in crisis. And then they stay. How great is that? With real practical help. They are there, including financial support for up to 2 years after the baby is born. I say again, how awesome is that? And here's where you can make a difference. Just $28 provides a free life-saving ultrasound. One chance for a mother to see her baby. And when she does, she is twice as likely to choose life. It is incredibly powerful. Preborn is trying to save 70,000 babies this year. This is what true Christ-centered compassion looks like, not just for the baby, but for the mother too. So don't just say you're pro-life, live it. Help save babies and support mothers today. Go to preborn.com/Emily or call 855-601-2229. That's preborn.com/Emily.